Let's now turn our focus to synagogues, scribes, and the study of the Torah. This is now the second of the two central pillars of first century Judaism. So in our previous video, we had talked about all about the temple, which was the center of Jewish life, where now we want to shift to understanding these synagogue communities spread throughout the Roman Empire, really symbolized by the Torah or the study of the law. So Mark Strauss says this: while the temple in Jerusalem was the center of Jewish worship, Judaism was becoming more decentralized with the growth in synagogue communities throughout the Roman Empire. Synagogues were Jewish meeting places for worship, education, and community gatherings. So these are important, and we actually see these in the Gospels a number of times. So let's talk about what a synagogue worship service entailed. The first, of course, was the confession of faith. We mentioned this briefly earlier from Deuteronomy 6, but this was called the Shema. And this was said twice a day. And the confession of faith was a combination of components from Deuteronomy 6, Deuteronomy 11, and Numbers 15. So this was an important part. This is how the synagogue worship service started. It was followed by prayers and readings from the law. So they would read from the Hebrew, but they would also read from what's called the Targum, which was an Aramaic paraphrase. Then there was a message. There was a sermon text. The rabbi would teach from the law, and also sometimes qualified Jewish men from within the congregation would actually stand up and read and instruct as well. And then it was closed with a benediction, the closing of the service. And this was marked by the blowing of the ram's horn, which both began and ended the service. And we see this happen in the New Testament. Jesus himself is part of this in Luke 4, where he says, "And he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. And as was his custom, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and he stood up to read." And this is, of course, where he basically says, "This is fulfilled in your sight." But this was a very common part of the synagogue communities. This happens also in Acts 13, when it says, when they went, this is Paul's first missionary journey, but when they went on from Perga, they came to Antioch in Pisidia, and on the Sabbath day, they went into the synagogue and they sat down. After the reading from the law and the prophets, the rulers of the synagogue sent a message to them saying, "Hey, brothers, if you have any word of encouragement for the people, say it." And of course, Paul, not going to waste an opportunity to share the gospel, stands up and motions with his hand, saying, "Men of Israel, and you who fear God, listen." And of course, he gives the testimony that Jesus is the Messiah. Many of them hate him for it and drive him out of town. But that was part of this synagogue worship service that we see a number of times in the Gospels as well as in the book of Acts. So it's important to know about the synagogue and the synagogue worship service was that the synagogue became the training ground for the growth and the influence of the scribes. Now, we need to understand the scribes. Now, what is a scribe, of course? Well, here's kind of a modern-day image of a Jewish scribe copying meticulously the Hebrew Old Testament text. But scribes were a very important group in the New Testament. Mark Strauss says, one of the most important developments in the post-exilic Jewish communities was the establishment of the profession of scribe, also called teachers of the law and lawyers in the New Testament. Scribes were experts in the exposition and interpretation of the law of Moses. In later Judaism, the term rabbi, meaning master or my teacher, tended to replace scribe. In the Gospels, Jesus is sometimes called rabbi by his disciples and others, but he's never called by the more technical term of a scribe. So a scribe is an important player in the New Testament scene because scribes are mentioned over and over and over again, and normally they are opposing Jesus, which we'll see as we continue our study of the Gospels. But scribes are actually traced all the way back to Ezra, who was a very important post-exilic leader in Israel. Remember when they were restructuring Israel after the exile, Ezra was a very important figure. And we read in Ezra 7:10 where it says, "For Ezra had set his heart to study the law of the Lord and to do it, and to teach its statutes and rules in Israel." And so the scribes were a group that were birthed out of a desire to basically teach the Torah, to make sure that the law of Moses was preserved and taught. And as they did, as the teaching of the Torah in these synagogue communities all throughout the Roman Empire grew and grew, so did the importance and the reputation and the authority of the scribes. Important to know that teaching was actually usually done by rote, or it was memorized. Students memorized and taught what was handed down. So a key component of scribal life was the authority of the one that you were trained under. So this helps us understand why people were astonished at Jesus in Mark 1, where it says they were astonished at Jesus' teaching, for he taught them as someone who had authority, but not as one of the scribes. They didn't know how Jesus had the authority he had when he was not trained in the scribal tradition, because they were such an important figure in first century Jewish life. So understanding that the Jewish people were dispersed and they studied throughout the Roman Empire, and this is where the role and the authority of scribe began to develop, is very important for helping us understand the importance of the Torah, or these synagogue communities, along with the temple in first century Jewish life. So again, temple and Torah, if we can get both of these down and understand how significant they are, again, it sets us up well to understand the background of the New Testament. So let's do one more section in this module. And here we want to talk about some of the groups, trends, and literary sources of Jewish life in the first century.